Hello and welcome to Lecture 9. In this lecture, I further examine how to incorporate a Global English East perspective into the EMI curriculum by taking a curriculum perspective. Taking a curriculum perspective enables us to ask key questions such as, who are the learners, the target group? What are their needs? Needs analysis. What is to be achieved? What is the purpose? The goals and objectives. What is to be taught? The syllabus. How should this be taught? The methodology. And how can we measure whether learners are learning the content and whether the goals have been met? The assessment. How can we ensure that it is effective? Curriculum evaluation. As I've noted, context is key in GELT. And as I have stressed elsewhere, there is no one-size-fits-all approach to EMI. Both English language teaching, or GELT, and EMI are both highly context-dependent, and needs analysis is crucial. Needs analysis often acts as the anchor for curriculum development and evaluation. If learners' needs change, the whole curriculum may need to be re-examined. Needs analysis is often the logical starting point in the curriculum design process. Once needs are identified, curriculum planners can set goals and objectives and then design the syllabus, methodology and assessment. But what is important to note again is that context is central. English proficiency is certainly a major factor in determining the success. Goals, sometimes referred to as aims, are often broader, outlining what learners should achieve by the end of a course or programme. They're often the foundation for the objectives, shorter-term statements of what learners need to know or be able to do to reach these goals. They're designed to be measurable and observable. Therefore, objectives unpack the goals. Setting goals and objectives is a critical step in curriculum development. In some contexts, the Common European Framework of Reference, the CEFR, continues to be used to develop goals. But can-do statements are somewhat out of sync with modern ideas regarding the benchmarks of learners, as is indicative in the following statements that appear in the Common European Framework of Reference, such as, learners are able to appreciate fully the sociolinguistic and socio-cultural implications of language used by native speakers and can react accordingly. And learners can sustain relationships with native speakers without unintentionally amusing or irritating them or requiring them to behave other than they would with a native speaker. In a GELT curriculum, the native speaker is not the assumed benchmark. A proficient learner may be able to interact with a degree of fluency and spontaneity that makes regular interaction with native speakers quite possible. In contexts where the CEFR has to be used, I urge practitioners to adapt it, making even the slightest changes to the benchmarks used in order to situate goals within global contexts rather than native speaker ones. So once needs have been examined and clear goals and objectives have been set, those designing EMI courses and programmes can then start to consider the syllabus, the content of what is to be covered. Once again, the GELT framework can be helpful here, both for EAP and ESP syllabus design and also for the content courses. In promoting a more globally orientated approach to education, GELT calls for a paradigm shift away from native English-speaking norms to reflect the use of English as a global lingua franca. The syllabus will of course vary according to the needs of the learners, the context and also the discipline itself. This applies to both delivering content and the EAP and ESP syllabus. Interdisciplinary collaboration was noted to be a major challenge in my own research. And in Costa and Coleman's study, 15% of the universities reported that a lack of collaboration between content teaching staff and language specialists was the greatest difficulty they faced. It has also been noted that one of the challenges to interdisciplinary collaboration in an EMI context is that the implementation of EMI is left almost exclusively in the hands of content lecturers in an institutional context of compartmentalized departments and areas of knowledge. Collaboration should be encouraged where possible. Discussion is needed on the disciplinary discourse practices, how to improve students' discipline-specific academic literacy, and whether there are coverage constraints due to students' English proficiency and/or their experience with EMI. The linguistic and cultural backgrounds of learners may of course vary from year to year, or semester to semester, class to class even. Some students may, for example, be more familiar with instructors encouraging active student participation by asking different types of questions, utilising group work and discussion activities, for example. On the other hand, some students may be unfamiliar with this approach and therefore reluctant to answer questions. In this module, we've already touched on the idea of seeing the student's mother tongue as a valuable resource in the classroom. And we've also seen how it can be a useful teaching tool. In GELT, the learner's L1 is seen as a valuable resource, and learners are encouraged to utilise their multilingual repertoires. In GELT, tasks should aim to reinforce learners' positive self-image as a legitimate speaker of a global language, and teachers should refrain from correcting so-called errors that Global English's researchers class more as innovations in language. When it comes to assessment in the curriculum, EMI programme developers have to consider the goals and the objectives of the programme. A construct in assessment refers to the definition of target language abilities. Good pieces of assessment are devised in respect of real-world criterion, which requires a detailed understanding of the language in use, hence the importance of needs analysis. There has been considerable debate over whether the construct for Global English's assessment should be based on a so-called standard English or English as a lingua franca. And in higher education, there are numerous debates surrounding academic norms. Assessment constructs are often based on standard English, but designing a Global English's test is also complex. As this module has highlighted, English as a lingua franca is not a codified variety of English. Its features are fluid and thus ill-fitting to operationalise as a test construct. Therefore, good assessment constructs, rather than being defined according to language form, are better defined according to success in communication. In short, taking a GELT perspective to EMI lobbies for a shift away from assessing learners' linguistic knowledge of English towards assessing learners' strategic use of English, as I mentioned previously. For an EMI programme, where language learning goals are key in many cases, or even where there is a dual focus of improving English proficiency and subject knowledge, then assessments should be based on both testing English and content knowledge. Curriculum evaluation can be formative or summative, and ideally an institution should employ both to provide regular up-to-date information. Ensuring evaluation procedures are in place can also reduce the risk of misalignment between the various curriculum elements. When evaluating EMI courses and programmes, the continuum of content and language integration presented in EA3 can also be helpful. Curriculum evaluators may find it useful to place their course along this continuum to determine whether the curriculum is aligned and what the goals of the programme are. If, for example, the course or programme is placed on the far right, then an examination of the models of EMI may be helpful to assess what type of support is both on offer and should be on offer to students. Placing programmes on this continuum may also be helpful at the national level to examine how institutions have interpreted government policies differently, for example, such as the Top Global University project in Japan. Universities may also utilise this at the institutional level to examine how different instructors interpret EMI policy differently. This lecture has highlighted then that the transition to EMI and the incorporation of a global English language teaching perspective has to be planned properly, and planners have to take into account various factors that may influence successful and long-term implementation. So that concludes Lecture 9. In this lecture, I further examined how to incorporate a global English perspective into the EMI curriculum. Taking a curriculum perspective enables us to look at the different elements of curriculum: needs analysis, goals and objectives, syllabus, methodology, assessment and evaluation. And it's important to ensure that these elements are aligned. Thank you for watching.